Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here. Go ahead. And I want to first, that's not my phone, right? Thank the Gaston Institute and the Center for Social Policy for the invitation. I actually spoke at Gaston many years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And so it's good to be back again. I want to thank Evelyn Frankfurt for being such a persistent inviter and getting me here, and all of you for being here. Good to see lots of old friends from Boston Public Schools, some of whom have come out of retirement to show up today. And again, it feels like home because it used to be home. I was only here for 3 years, but I did get to know quite a bit about not just Boston and Cambridge, but also the state of Massachusetts. And I'll share some of those stories, because those stories, I think, are still relevant today. We're at a point where education continues to be a central issue of public policy, which is interesting given all the other issues that are demanding attention, from 2 wars to the collapse of, rapid collapse of several governments now in the Middle East, to our failing economy and the massive loss of jobs and houses, to debates over health care and climate change. With all that out there on the agenda, education still keeps rising as important. So important that President Obama has on numerous occasions, including most recently the State of the Union address, spoken about education as being critical to the country's future. And I think that speaks, again, not just to the fact that the politicians understand that it's important, but to the fact that the general populace understands that education is critical to our future as a country. Problem is that when an issue gets a lot of attention, it also can get kind of blurred. And the terms of the debate can get confusing to people. And I think we're at that moment right now. There are many very polarized debates taking place in education. And sometimes the polarization prevents us from seeing clearly where the truth lies. And I try to increasingly engage the media in trying to at least add my voice to where I think truth lies. But it's not easy, because there are very powerful interests with lots and lots of money associated with certain perspectives. Right? And when Bill Gates decided that education was his priority, well, he takes up a lot of space. And increasingly, that's the voice you hear more than any other. So as Diane Ravitch says now, there's a new orthodoxy that's emerged about what constitutes reform. And even the term reform now is associated with a particular set of ideas. And those include the spread of charter schools, the idea that we should judge teachers by test scores, and, or as Michelle Rhee would put it, fire bad teachers, that will solve the problem. The idea that we should close failing schools, shut them down, as New York City has done to over 100 schools already in the last 10 years. And the idea that groups like Teach for America are what we need to save public education, which is why the Obama administration gave them $50 million from their innovation funds. Now, my position is not quite the same as Diane Ravitch's, right? Although she and I agree on many things. I, for example, am not opposed to charter schools. I support good schools, regardless of what type they are. And I go to far too many charter schools that are doing a great job at serving the needs of the children to oppose them for ideological reasons. At the same time, I think it's absolutely essential that charter schools be held accountable. And far too many charter schools across the country are pushing kids out that are hard to serve, or simply not enrolling them in the first place. And whenever you see charter schools that have very few special needs students or English language learners, and they are not being held accountable for it, it is actually creating a greater challenge on our public schools, because that's invariably where those kids go. I wrote an article in New York City for a local paper called Designed to Fail about the school closure issue. Because my argument, my contention was that the schools that the Department of Education in New York City was closing had in fact been designed to fail because they were deliberately required to over-enroll high-need students, and then were staffed deliberately with inexperienced teachers. And anybody who knows that thinks that recipe will ever work, you'll show me the evidence. In fact, the Department of Education had a study done. It was not a public study, but now has since been released, which in fact showed just that, that if you increase the number of high-need students to pass a certain percentage, the chance that that school will be successful is almost nil. But these are the kind of policies that we see being pursued under this new orthodoxy. And so is the idea that poverty is not an issue. Right? I had a debate with Joe Williams. Joe Williams is another important figure in this, who is with Democrats for Education Reform, about the issue of poverty. And Joe Williams, along with several of these other new reformers, take the no excuses position. Right? Actually, that's also the name of a book by Stephen and Abigail Thernstrom, in which they argue that poverty should not be an excuse, and that what poor kids need is the kind of education that Roxbury Prep offers. Right? Now, those of you who know Roxbury Prep, charter school here in Boston, is widely held up as one of the most successful charter schools in the country. And I don't knock Roxbury Prep, okay? Because I would say, especially when you compare a school like Roxbury Prep, which all their kids are kids of color, to many of the traditional public schools in Boston, Roxbury Prep outshines them by miles. Except that when I visited and was given a tour by John King, who was the former headmaster, who is now the Deputy Commissioner of Education in New York State, I was struck by the fact that children are not allowed to speak in the hallways. And there's this very tight regimentation. And I said to John, I said, well, what's the purpose of that? He said, well, we want to maintain a very tight control. That's part of the no excuses philosophy. If you read a book by David Whitman called Sweating the Small Stuff, he describes that philosophy. It's all about controlling posture, controlling eye contact, controlling movements. And I said, well, you know, I've never been to a school that serves wealthy kids that treats them this way. And he said, well, that might be true. I said, well, then my question to you is, what are you preparing these kids for? Are you preparing them to be leaders or followers? Because leaders get to talk in the hallway, right? And get to eat with their friends at lunchtime. But that idea didn't really resonate with John, and it doesn't resonate with much of that crowd, because that's not really what that reform is about. It's about raising test scores. Because under this new orthodoxy, the only thing that matters are test scores. And that's the basis on which we judge schools. The last time I was in Boston was for a discussion before the new members of Congress that was held at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And they invited Michelle Rhee, Margaret Spellings, the former Secretary of Education, and myself to address them about the reauthorization of ESEA, the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, now known as No Child Left Behind. As you could expect, Margaret Spellings was there to defend, say it's the best thing we've ever done as a country. Michelle Rhee was there to say, just keep firing bad teachers and it'll all be okay. And I was there to say, a policy that has left us with dropout rates of 50% and higher in almost every major city is a policy that's clearly failed. And even the Republican congressman had to agree. Because the evidence of failure is widespread. In fact, that's what President Obama was speaking about, the State Union address, is the international comparisons. Because every time these international comparisons are done, we are falling further and further behind. Which then leads them to say, well, then we've got to do more and more accountability, more raising of standards. And I said, well, if kids were failing under the previous standards, why do you think raising this standard is going to give you different results? What we've been witnessing under this regime, under this policy of No Child Left Behind, is the most distorted use of assessment that has ever been seen before. Because we literally pretend as if kids will get smarter by testing them. And any educator knows the only value to assessment is if it's used for diagnostic purposes. and if you get the results from those assessments back to teachers in a timely manner. But in most states, we assess the kids in the spring, and we give the teachers the results in the fall when they no longer have the students. And we largely use the assessments for the purpose of ranking kids and ranking schools. Because the other part of the theory is that you can use pressure and humiliation to improve schools. Now, like the other ideas that are in their whole bag of tricks, none of them are actually based on evidence. I've never seen any evidence that humiliation works as an improvement strategy. State of Florida decided they would put letter grades on schools as part of their humiliation strategy. So there are A schools and F schools in Florida. New York City's now borrowed that idea too and put letter grades on schools. Now it's interesting because that idea actually came from Los Angeles County. But it wasn't to grade schools, it was to grade restaurants for cleanliness, sanitation. But Jeb Bush thought it was a good idea to bring it to schools. So I visit Edison High School in Miami, which is a triple F school. And I asked the principal, well, how do you get to be triple F? And he says, well, you simply fail the FCAT, the state exam, 3 times in a row. And he says, and we will fail again. I said, you'll fail again, why? He says, because 85% of our kids don't speak English. They just arrived in this country, and there's no way they're going to pass this exam, so we will be a quadruple F school. And since then, they have failed a 5th time. I said, are you worried about this? He says, not at all. I said, why not? He said, because the state can't take us over. There are too many schools just like us all over Florida. Now, first of all, I would think that if the state of Florida puts an F on the building and allows children to go there, the state should be sued. Because it has let everybody know this is a failing school. This school is not fit, but keep going. But what's really absurd about this is if the state of Florida were to take control of Edison High School, would they know what to do? Is there some secret recipe they've been holding back on that they will make available to those students? Absolutely not, because the record of state takeovers across the country, including here in Massachusetts, we're just talking about Lawrence, which has been under state control for how long? Too long? Newark's been under state control. Compton's been under state control. Go on down the list. It's one of abysmal failure. So the idea that you could even use the threat of state takeovers as a way to get schools to improve is totally absurd. Just as is the idea that you can simply shut down a failing school. Try to explain this to Mike Bloomberg, but when you're a billionaire, you don't think you have to listen to people too much. He was bragging about the fact that he's closed 100 schools. I said, well, that would be fine if your job was to close schools. Well, your job is to help schools. If the CEO of General Motors said, well, I've closed 100 plants. I said, well, no wonder we're in such bad shape. We actually are supposed to sell cars, not stop selling cars, right? Business of education is to educate kids. And if you close schools without ever figuring out why they failed in the first place, why do you think opening them up under a new name with new staff is going to work? BPS folks, it's just dawned on the DOE because now they've decided under Arnie Duncan they're going to just transform schools. Right? Like they have a wand. You will transform, right? First, you got to fire the principal. That's part of the requirement. Must fire the principal. Well, guess what? Is there some other group of principals just waiting for their chance? Where's this reservoir of highly effective principals waiting for their chance to take on these schools? That was the Central Falls fallacy, right? Again, Arnie Duncan applauded the mass firing of teachers in Central Falls. And then they had to rehire all of them. Why? Because there was nobody else that worked in those schools. So we continue to pursue stupid policies. I know that sounds harsh. But what else can you say when you see the results? And when you see that we are not getting any better, even though the rhetoric makes it sound like we are, because we've adopted the rhetoric of the corporate sector, right? Which is, again, part of the reason why they like test scores. They think it's like reading the stock market. Are they up? Are they down? Well, New York State, just before Mike Bloomberg ran for re-election for his 3rd term, which he wasn't allowed, but he engineered to have, test scores were rising. just before the election. 90% of the schools were labeled either A or B. We were supposed to be the miracle, gap closing, until the state decided, you know what, we have to recalibrate the scores. You know why? Because 80% of the kids graduated from New York City, and not just New York City, New York State public schools were required to take remedial courses in college because they weren't prepared. So they basically were repeating high school in college. So the state says, well, guess what? If the diploma is not really meaningful, then the score means nothing either. And when they recalibrated the scores, lo and behold, New York City didn't look as good as they thought. But he got his third term already. So we're going to have to ask ourselves, what are we doing wrong here? And unfortunately, the Secretary of Education is not asking that question, nor is, unfortunately, President Obama. Now, I say this as the person who worked on the transition team, who advised this administration, at least before they took office. So I support this administration. I'm hoping that the protests in Madison are a wake-up call, because I keep trying to tell them, teachers are actually your base. Right? You need teachers in the next election. And if you continue to pursue policies that blame teachers for the problems facing public schools, chances are you're going to alienate your base. But it's not simply about the politics of this. It's about actually what's in the best interest of children. How are we going to make sure that more kids get the education they need? And it's pretty clear that the path we're on is not taking us there. So a number of us have been arguing, and I've been working with, in fact, Tom Pizant, your former superintendent, is one of those people. We started something called the Broader and Bolder Approach to Reform. You can look it up online, look at the signatories, and we said that we need a different approach. At the minimum, we need to do three things. We need to make sure that there's universal access to early childhood education. Because all the research has shown us for years that the learning that begins at infancy lays the foundation for what happens throughout life. And the government, the federal government, is known that its most effective anti-poverty program ever it's adopted is Head Start. Because the children who get Head Start, when you compare them to the kids who don't, have better lifetime outcomes. It's cost effective to invest in early childhood education. And we've known for years, the achievement gap doesn't start at 5, it starts well before 5. Because poor kids come to school with vocabularies that are less developed than middle-class children from college-educated parents. It's common sense. But as my father likes to say, common sense really isn't that common, especially in education policy making. Kathy McCartney, who's the dean at the Ed School here at Harvard, who studies early childhood education, she described going to a conference in Italy and was about to present, and some Italian researchers next to her said, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm doing a study measuring the effectiveness of different early childhood education programs. And Tal said, oh. I said, that's a very American focus, isn't it? So she thought there was an insult implied. She said, well, what are you focusing on? She said, well, we're focusing on how to make sure all kids get good early childhood education. I said, oh, different focus. Think about this. Montessori were widely regarded as one of the best models for early childhood education, which actually is the antithesis to the no excuses model, right? Because instead of regimentation, kids in Montessori programs they get to explore, they get to do what they want to do, and they learn to be self-disciplined and self-motivated when Montessori is done right. It was developed by Maria Montessori, a physician in the ghettos of Rome with the poorest children. But upon being imported to this country, it became almost exclusively available to affluent children. Because the policies we're describing are really policies for poor children, not for the middle class. It's poor children that are going to school right now where, under the guise of raising test scores, they're taking away everything that's not on the test. Music's not on the test, taken away. Art's not on the test, taken away. Physical education, not on the test. So you're seeing schools that are reducing the amount of time that kids get phys ed when we know obesity is the #1 health challenge facing kids across America, especially poor kids. Recess is definitely not on the test. I saw a study the other day that said that eating lunch was good for test scores, and I said, thank God. Thank God. They might take lunch too. But again, we only do that to poor children. We only do that to poor children. We don't do that to middle-class kids. They get lunch and recess and art, music too. So we said in addition to early childhood education, we also need to make sure we give them health care. Universal access to health care, because health is an educational issue too. Sick kids don't do that well. We have lots of sick kids going to school. We have, my colleague Richard Rothstein, who's also part of this initiative, has said, you know, we could actually raise test scores if we simply made sure that all kids who needed it got to see a dentist, all kids who needed it got to get the eyeglasses. Think about how many kids have trouble reading because they need eyeglasses. Got the lead paint out of their homes. That would bump scores. But we approach education through narrow vision, tunnel vision, and so we don't recognize health as being an educational issue. And consequently, we see lots of kids whose families don't have health care not performing at the levels they should. So we said we need health care, and we also said we need to extend learning opportunities, because American kids are not getting enough, especially poor kids. If you read Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, he talks about that, compares, we were talking about this over lunch, the amount of education, the amount of learning time American children get in comparison to European and Asian kids. They get a longer year, a longer day. Now, I would have to be careful here, because more of a bad thing is not a good thing, okay? So I'm not just prescribing add-on hours to a day that's already bad. Right? So we do have to look at the quality of what's being provided, but we do have to look at extending learning opportunities, because it's very clear that middle-class kids are going to summer camp and they're going to all kinds of enrichment, and poor kids are not getting that same learning opportunity, for the most part. Now, we thought these were pretty common sense ideas, and in fact, Arne Duncan thought so too. He signed on to the initiative while he was still superintendent of Chicago. But once being named Secretary of Education, suddenly the support for this kind of a vision evaporated. Now, it still shows up in the Promised Neighborhood Initiative, so John will speak about that later, because I'm glad to see, but I'm also concerned because I think the Republican Congress is going to take all the money away in that very, I think, visionary plan. But there was a study done on Chicago public schools, and it was written by Anthony Breich, professor at the University of Chicago, but also by John Easton at the Chicago Consortium for Public Education, who now is the director of the Office of Research at the U.S. Department of Education, so he works for Duncan. And the focus of the study, it's called Organizing for School Improvement. The focus of the study was to ask, why did 10 years of school reform in Chicago not result in more improvement for certain schools and for certain kids? And when they look closely at the schools that did not improve, what do they find? What they find is that the children of what William Julius Wilson called the truly disadvantaged had other needs that the schools were not addressing. And lo and behold, once again we learned what Coleman told us many years ago, is that if you don't address the other aspects of child development, health, nutrition, safety, children don't do so well academically. ETS produced a report called Why Aren't We Making More Progress? Found the same thing. They said we're not making more progress because we stopped addressing poverty. Ended the war on poverty. Very little focus on ending poverty anymore. In fact, we have people like Joel Klein, Michelle Reese saying poverty is not an issue. And those are the ideas. Arne Duncan got on television on Charlie Rose right after the PISA results were announced. The PISA was the comparisons of 65 wealthiest nations on a set of math, literacy, and science. And he said, poverty is not an issue. Even though when you disaggregate the scores in the United States, it becomes so obvious, poverty is the issue. Inequality is the issue. So we believe we need a different approach. And we believe that part of the reason why the past reforms have failed is because they haven't focused on these other issues. In fact, what they focused on is symptoms of problems rather than the underlying causes. Right? Try to explain that to Arne Duncan again. He said he wants to shut down 5,000 dropout factories. 5,000 dropout factories across the country. These are the high schools that are dropping out more kids than they graduate. Sounds tough. And I said, guess what, Arne? It's a bigger problem than that. So for every failing high school, there's a failing middle school feeding right into it. And then a failing elementary school coming right behind. When kids are entering high school reading at the 3rd and 4th grade level, it's not simply a high school problem. It's bigger than that. What they don't understand is why failure has become normalized, built into the way certain schools operate. That's the issue. It's pervasive, especially in poor communities. And a lot of that is because many schools lack the capacity to respond to the needs of kids, particularly as they relate to poverty and family distress. And many of those schools have dysfunctional cultures. Charles Payne, who is now the chief academic officer for the Chicago Public Schools, a sociologist from the University of Chicago, wrote a book called So Much Reform, Why So Little Change? And he goes into several of the high schools where they've been spending lots of money to redesign the schools, restructure the schools, new technology, small learning communities. Still failing. Why? Well, once he goes in, he realizes right away, a sick and dysfunctional culture. Culture where the teachers don't work together, strained relations between the administration and the teachers alienated from the kids, no cooperation with families. This is not an environment where progress is possible. And you can keep pouring money into schools that are like this, and you will never get improvement. So the conservatives are right about one thing. Money alone is not the answer. Right? Dorchester High showed us that. Where's Joan Decker? She watched that one closely, right? We spent how much on there was a philanthropist gave Dorchester High big gift. Right? Right? I went a few years after, I said, whatever happened to all that money? I said, well, a lot of consultants got paid. Dorchester High didn't get much better, though. So something's wrong with the way we've been approaching it. I think a lot of what's wrong is we're ignoring the critical issues. We're ignoring the non-academic needs of kids. We're ignoring the learning environment in the schools. But we keep thinking that if we just raise standards, that somehow things will get better. Now, I was here during the first MCAS debate. And I was asked by Paul Revelle, now your commissioner, to participate in debate before several members of the state representatives, not assembly. And I said then, there's not a single public official in Massachusetts who can guarantee that the kids who will fail the MCAS were actually prepared. It took a while for the guy I was debating, who was an attorney, to understand what I was saying. He said, well, that's right. He said, but we're going to do it anyway. And they did. And that first year that the MCAS was taken, about 6,000 kids failed the exam and were denied diplomas. And the state declared victory. Democrats and Republicans, Boston Globe, victory for high standards. And it only makes sense if you know who the 6,000 kids were. 1/3 special needs kids. The IEP told you they couldn't do it. The other third, English language learners. Hard to take a test in a language you don't read and write. The other third, kids from Boston, Lawrence, Springfield, go on down the list, Holyoke, the places we knew were already failing. But we declared victory for high standards. We did a different approach. And I would say that what's pretty clear is that approach has to start by challenging the assumptions about failure. Brockton High showed us that. It's interesting, because Brockton High defied the conventional wisdom. At a time when everyone else was following the Gates Foundation's prescription to go small, they said, no, we're not going small. So Brockton High is over 4,000 students. Brockton High is diverse. Over 50% of the kids come from families where English is not spoken as the first language. Brockton High serves over 60% of the kids low income. But Brockton High is a high-performing school. Because 10 years ago, they decided what they would focus on was literacy. And every teacher at the school would become a teacher of literacy. Math teachers, science teachers, physical education teachers, all would teach literacy because they believed that if kids got more language instruction, they would actually be prepared for those exams. And lo and behold, it worked. It didn't work overnight. It took a concerted effort. It took getting buy-in from that staff, because they knew it was that staff that was going to have to lead this effort, not Superman. But that's what it took. I encourage you to go on PBS website, look at a program called Need to Know, where we analyze what happened at Brockton High and its successes. Too many schools are being asked to improve, but they're not even given clear guidance on what they need to do differently. You know, we know not only doesn't more money necessarily make a difference, working harder at the wrong things doesn't make a difference. I go to school sometimes and the principals are killing themselves. They're putting in 14-hour days and nothing is getting better because they're putting their time into the wrong things. They're chasing kids around the hallway. I won't talk about any people I know who might still work in Boston now, but I used to visit many of the high schools where I remember one high school. We were doing a study trying to understand why certain high schools in Boston were getting better and others were not. I visited one of the high schools here where 50% of the seniors were on track to not graduate because they couldn't pass the MCAS. We gave feedback to the principal and said, look, many of these kids have not been prepared. They haven't even taken the courses. They're also not learning anything in class because the teachers aren't teaching them anything. And you know, what are you going to do? He says, well, I don't know what to do about that, but we've got to get these kids to pass the MCAS. So that's why I'm bringing Kaplan in. I said, you're going to bring in Kaplan? I said, well, test prep doesn't make up for what you have never learned. He said, well, that might be true, but we got to pass this exam. He said, you know what my big problem is at this school? He said, my biggest problem at this school is I have 27 doors. I said, 27 doors? He said, there's too many ways for kids to get out. He said, I have to have somebody at every door. I said, do you ever wonder why they want to escape? We're focused on the wrong things. We're focused on the wrong things, and that shows up over and over again. So we reform schools without addressing the core issues, and we're spending lots of money. Gates Foundation spent over $2 billion on the small school effort. They don't even talk about that one anymore. They act like it never happened. Why? Because it didn't work. They didn't get the results. So now they're fixated on judging teachers by test scores. That's where their money is. If that worked, then Tennessee should be the leading state in the country, because they've been doing it longer than anybody else. It's not. It's not, because there's a whole lot more that goes into student performance than even what the teacher does. So we are in need of a different approach. And the good news is that there are several schools across the country that are showing us that approach already. Problem is, we're not learning from them. I visited such a school in Brooklyn, PS 28. High-performing, high-poverty school. Those schools exist. They're not myths. Read Karen Chenoweth's book, It's Being Done. She describes several of those schools across the country. PS 28 is a school where all the kids are poor, 40% of the kids are homeless. Still a high-performing school. I went to visit the school. Sadie Silva, the principal, gives me a tour. First thing she explains to me is that her secretary is the chief administrator. She runs the school. I said, well, what do you do? She said, I'm the lead teacher. She said, I didn't become a principal to escape the classroom. I became principal to lead the classrooms. We go visit the classrooms, and every classroom I go into has 3 and 4 adults in them. I said, how do you manage to get that many adults in the classroom? She said, well, all our special ed teachers are in the classrooms. Our librarian is in the classroom. Our counselors are in the classroom. Our aides are in the classrooms, because that's the way we differentiate. We don't differentiate by expecting one teacher to figure out how to reach 28 different kids at different levels. We have different adults working together, collaborating to meet student needs. She explains to me that the school stays open every night till 8 o'clock because the shelters don't open till 8 o'clock. And she doesn't want the kids roaming around the streets until the shelters open. I said, well, how do you get teachers to stay that late? She said, the teachers don't stay. The YMCA runs the second shift. They come in and they run the school. They run our after-school programs. The kids get art and music. They get homework help, reading. They do chess. They get swimming lessons on Thursdays because they want their kids to get a well-rounded education. She explains that in the evenings, parents can do GED classes. They can take ESL class, learn English if they want to study English. They can get job training if they want to be security guards or nurses' aides. I said, you do that? She said, I don't do that. I have a partnership with a job training agency that comes in and provides that to my parents, because she believes that if her parents are educated and employed, they'll do a better job with their kids. Takes me into a professional development session that's going on, being led by 2 social workers, where teachers are learning how to respond to the social and emotional needs of children. And they're posing questions to the social workers about what's going on in their classroom. One teacher says he has a problem with the student who has attachment issues. He says, he's attached to my leg, I can't teach. And then she works him through. She said, I want you to try this to get him to earn your attention. Another teacher said, I have a kid with anger. Another one said, I got a kid with anxiety. And she says, I said, what made you decide to offer professional development in this? She said, until I did, my teachers were referring too many of my kids to special education. And the classes were just filling up. So what I knew I had to do was I had to increase their skills, because those are our kids. She explains to me that in addition to providing all these services for parents and for children, that they also have a project with Rikers Island, with juveniles at Rikers Island. Rikers Island, actually the largest penal institution in the world, where kids on work release on weekends come in and do repairs in the building. I said, why that? She said, because those kids will get out one day, and I want them to realize this school is theirs too. And just before we're leaving, she said, let me introduce my counselor. But before I do, let me tell you, I got him from the rubber room. I said, rubber room? Now, those of you who don't know New York don't know. The rubber room is this place where they put teachers that nobody wants, or at least that have been assigned there by their principals for whatever reason, and they could be there for years sometimes. It's like being in purgatory, right? I said, you got him from the rubber room. How do you know to get him from the rubber room? She said, well, I don't know why he was in the rubber room. But when I found out he was there, I requested him because he had been my guidance counselor when I was at school. And he literally saved my life. So I said, I want him. So I go into the room and I meet him, and he introduces me to a little boy who was sitting there talking to him. So I asked the little boy, why are you here? He says, I'm here to learn to be good. So I said, is it working? He said, I hope so. So I'm tired of being sent out of class. But what struck me was this was a conversation between this adult and this child. This was not a punishment session. He wasn't about to send him home to watch TV for a few days under the guise of discipline. He really was trying to focus on how to get this young man to be responsible for his own behavior. So I'm really impressed, and by the time I'm leaving, I said, well, this is so impressive. She said, I have to show you one more thing. She said, let me show you my data. She takes me to her office and she shows me her data system. And she explains that they are monitoring every single student in the school. They know exactly where they are. They have portfolios with their work in it, and they know which student is where, who's making progress, who's not making progress, who needs what kind of support. So we don't leave anything to chance. We're not going to let any of these kids slip through the cracks. So I leave. I send an email to Joel Klein, the chancellor. I say, you need to go visit PS 28, see what they're doing there. 2 days later, he goes. He's so impressed, he sends out a memo to every principal in New York City describing his visit. Except he only mentions one thing, the data system. Because they had spent lots of money on this data system. He was happy to see someone using it. I write back and I said, Joel, I'm glad you visited, but you missed it. Because it's not just the data system. It's all the other things that school's doing that makes it work. And that's part of the problem. The farther you are from the classrooms, the less you get it. Often. And unfortunately, those are the people making the policies. And they don't realize it does take that broader approach, that more inclusive strategy. Even though the evidence is there that it's actually working. McCormick Middle School, I'm not sure how McCormick is now, but McCormick used to be a school where they had no problem at all with parental involvement. Parents in droves coming out. And you go to so many schools where parent involvement is a problem. It's a problem now at McCormick. That's the other problem, is that success isn't easy to sustain, you know. Get changes in leadership, you can get a whole different outcome for schools. But I won't describe all these schools because we don't have the time, but each of them is building the capacity of their schools to meet student needs. That's what they're doing. They have strategies that focus like a laser on teaching and learning, so they are holding teachers accountable, because that is right. There's got to be evidence that kids are learning. You know, they are right about that. The only problem is the only evidence can't be a test score. It's got to be more than that. Can the kids write? Can they read? They focus on extending learning opportunities. They focus on safety. Safety is a learning issue, isn't it? Can't learn in an unsafe environment. May have many kids not going to school because they will be jumped on the way to school. In certain neighborhoods, if you're not a member of a gang, you are vulnerable. They have partners in the community, and they develop those partners based on the needs of their kids. So if the kids need a dentist, they bring a dentist in. Sadie Silver didn't wait for the chancellor to ask, what help do you need? She went out and got help based on understanding community. So schools like these function as a part of a community, not in isolation from the community. They focus on families, because all the research shows parents matter. And if you get more parents to reinforce the importance of learning at home, children will do better academically. They focus on health and nutrition, because that's absolutely essential for healthy child development, and we can't separate healthy child development from academic achievement. Now, it would really help if this weren't just a school strategy, if this were policy at a local, state, and federal level. If we didn't leave it up to visionary, hard-working principals to make it happen, but we actually had superintendents and mayors, especially in cities where mayors have control, Boston, right? Developing a local strategy for bringing resources in to schools, for supporting teachers, and for aligning the academic strategy with the service strategy, because they have to be aligned. It's not good enough to just focus on services and not focus on the academics. They have to be integrated. The narrow approach, the one we've known, focuses narrowly on achievement, focuses on test scores, as the evident focuses on scripted curriculum, right? Especially in the low-performing schools. Focuses on holding principals, and I would say students accountable, largely. Now they want to extend that to teachers. It treats parents as consumers, not as partners. Right? So if parents don't like it, they can walk. Right? That's the charter school strategy. And they focus on various kind of fad reforms. The reforms we know shift and change from year to year. The broader approach focuses on the conditions for teaching and learning, and supporting those and making sure those are in place. Focuses on the whole child, health, nutrition, and safety, as well as academics and intellectual development. It focuses on helping teachers to develop the skills to meet the learning needs. So if you're serving English language learners, then you need every teacher to be a teacher of English language learners, not a bilingual specialist. Right? We have a number of schools, international schools in New York City now, that are showing us you can work even with the students with interrupted formal education. Right? The hardest to serve population. These are the kids who are not literate in their own languages, who come to this country as adolescents, and these schools are getting great results with those kids because every single member of the staff knows how to meet their needs. They focus on an enriched curriculum, one that goes well beyond preparing kids for tests, but thinks about preparing them for life, preparing them for college, preparing them for work, which is very different focus. And they focus on expanding learning opportunities and holding everyone accountable, including the students themselves. Students have to be accountable. Most of the schools I go to don't even have a strategy for how to get kids to be invested in learning. No strategy in place. They don't even think about it. Guess what? If you can't create schools, especially high schools, where it's cool to be smart, much of what adults are trying to do is never going to work because the kids don't buy in. And the kids are distracted, and the kids aren't focused, and the kids don't believe that by spending their time in learning, that it'll actually make a difference for them. So we need a different strategy. And again, when you look at schools like Brockton High, when you look at schools like PS 28, and several others that I could mention, you see a very different approach in place already and different outcomes. So my question is, why aren't we learning from success? Why isn't policy based on figuring out how to replicate what we see working? Why do we pretend that success doesn't exist? Now, it's true, these are exceptions. But there are enough of these exceptions now to know this can be done. So I would say the challenge for policy is to figure out, how do we replicate that? How do we do more of what works? One of the things we're trying to do, I'm working in Newark, New Jersey right now. I was there before Mark Zuckerberg decided to donate $100 million there. And actually, you know, the $100 million has actually become more of a problem. It's a little like, you ever see a family that's got a big, someone dies, they get a big inheritance, and everybody starts fighting? Well, that's what's happened in Newark, right? Fighting over who's going to control the money, what's going to happen. $100 million sounds like a lot of money. It's a quarter of the district's budget in 1 year. Right? So when you see it in the larger scheme of things, it's really not that much money. We were there trying to do what the Harlem Children's Zone does for $70 million. We were trying to do it for much cheaper. And we figured we want to do that by building a sustainability strategy. We're building it through university partnerships. We're doing it by getting the medical school involved with the schools. We're trying to get neighborhood institutions that have a long-term commitment to Newark to support schools.